Many years ago, a long, long time ago, when I first met Swami Kriyananda, which was 1969, he was in his early 40s, very dynamic, very unusual. At that time, he had his hair quite long and he wore Indian clothes even in America. His beard was longer, his hair was longer. It was the late 60s and we were all wearing interesting costumes, a lot of us anyway, so he didn't really stand out that much. In fact, in my book about him, Jaya tells this little story about the first time he met Swamiji. He described what he was wearing, which is an outfit I actually saw Swami wear often. He used to wear a dhoti, which is like a lungi, a long garment that's wrapped like a skirt. He would wear an orange dhoti, he would wear an Indian kurta, long Indian shirt almost to his knees. And that would sort of be his basic garb. Sometimes he'd wear Rudraksha mala around it. But then he couldn't really go barefoot or wear little sandals in the Bay Area in the winter, so he would put on a pair of dark socks and loafers. And then if it was cold, he'd put on an overcoat, and then he used to sport a French beret. And he was sort of as I said, a United Nations of fashion, just by himself. And Jaya, when he first saw him dressed like that, he said, "This man is completely himself. I like him." That's how he put it. You know, everything was inherently logical, but the result was, well, what it was. And I was listening yesterday to a film about Rumi, who's a mystic poet, a Sufi poet. I'm not really familiar or a devotee of Rumi's poems. I think I learned more about them yesterday than I ever knew. And in the context of that conversation about Rumi, these individuals who were speaking on the film were just talking about the world that Rumi was seeing, which is the world of self-realization, the same world that we're talking about. And they were making that wonderful statement that even though the world we look at through our senses seems huge, and because we're convinced by our senses that the physical body is small by comparison, we tend to think of the inner world as somehow being smaller and also being subject to the outer world. I mean, no matter how strong our philosophy, that's really the bias. And you think of contracting in some sense when you close your eyes, whereas in fact, as Master called it, the physical world is like the tiny little basket underneath the balloon of the astral world, and then the infinite sky above that. That, in other words, as we often talk about it, the egoic incarnation in the human body is the most contracted aspect of ourselves. It's not the most expanded, it's the most contracted. And once we incarnate in that physical body and live in this world, then we start seeing the world through the senses. And if you travel across the globe, you know how vast the world is if you stand on the edge of a sea. Whereas in fact, it's this enormous, well, beyond measurement, the infinite spirit, literally, which is just coming through this tiny little crack of the window of our ego. And one of Rumi's poems made this simple statement that everything in creation is talking to us about that inner world. It was just a beautiful image, and I was very struck by it. We're also doing a class on Swamiji's book, The Hindu Way of Awakening, which is all about the esoteric meaning behind some of those extraordinary symbols that people think of as Hinduism, and how all of them talk to us about some reality that can't be described in an entirely rational way. And I began to just sort of look around and see life and sort of see it in that way. I was thinking, because I've been involved with the school in the last few weeks with the school play and dealing with the children. And the children are small in their physical bodies, but of course, those little tiny children could have been your mother in the last lifetime. It's not like there's anything small about their consciousness. They're just little in their bodies. In fact, it was very interesting. I put a costume. I've been working with the costumes. I put a costume on one of the 5-year-old boys, and I must say it was a really terrific costume for him. And it was red, and it had some brocade on it, and it just worked absolutely perfectly. We put it on him, and it matched his spirit. And it was so interesting because he looked at himself in the mirror, And I think he saw what I saw, which is he actually saw himself as he really was. Because he was dressed like an adult person and he was dressed like a king, in fact. And all of a sudden, his little body straightened up and this extremely serious and exalted look came on his face. It was like he finally looked like he was supposed to look to himself. And I had a funny experience that way, speaking of costumes. Years ago, we did the play about St. Francis. We did it last year, and then we'd done it about a decade earlier. And earlier in the history of our school, when we were still building it up, and so many of the children were small, we used to have adult actors in it just so that somebody would have a clue as to what was going on, and also to give the younger children some feeling of what theater was really like by acting against adults. Then they had to, we knew how to take it seriously, and they would rise to that. And I played the part of St. Clare in that play, and I was sort of like the theatrical device was that Clare was telling the story of her life to some young nuns. So mostly I just sat there and did pretty much what I do here, which is just chat about spiritual things. But in the course of that, I got to wear a nun's costume that we borrowed, and it was this dove gray thing with a little white, just completely. And I was back in the minister's room putting this thing on. These are moments in the mirror. And I finally got the thing on just exactly right. I was raised Jewish, believe me, so I had no relationship to these things. And I went and I looked in the mirror, and I had the oddest sensation of finally looking like I'm supposed to look. It was like that image in the mirror was recognizable to me, and I felt like all my life I've been looking for this outfit, and nothing ever quite looked right. And in fact, it was a little spooky for my husband and for a few other people, because once I got inside that nun's outfit, I didn't want to come out. This was just like, this is where I meant to be. These past life experiences, all of this world is talking to us about this deep inner reality. A couple of weeks ago, I wrote this in a letter that some of you have read, but a couple of weeks ago, I ended up telling you the story about when I was 7 years old, and I had a traumatic experience of doing something dishonest and being found out almost immediately, like little children are. Children can just, they're naivete, I didn't do it. One of Davy once said about her son, who was really small, he came to her when he was about 5, and he said, "I didn't do nothing in the closet." No, I didn't do nothing. And she said, "Oh, that's nice, darling. Where did you not do nothing?" He said, "In the closet." And she went in, and it turned out for some reason, he'd opened all her vitamins and poured them on the floor. Who knows what moves a child's mind, But anyway, there it was, and so that's where he did nothing, was in the closet. Just like they are trying to persuade you. So I was telling this story about what was really a very traumatic incident for me, and my mother holding me on her lap and being so compassionate. And when I was telling that story here, I was almost weeping about it. And you think, I'm more than 60 years old. I was 7 a long time ago, and a lot of life has flowed through me. But it's like time is not really there, especially where our deep feelings are concerned. And it was, I went back into that whole experience, and now this is just one lifetime. We look around us, we read in the paper, if you turn on the television, you see really tough things are happening to people all the time. Big tragedies, little tragedies, sudden tragedies, long, agonizing tragedies, great joys, all this stuff. And boy, it's happened to all of us. This world is always talking to us about the inner world. And when we study and talk about the chakras and the way the chakras work, what the chakras are, those are the storing, that's the big cosmic file system of all of your experiences. And when the body dies and the memory of this little life fades away, the vibratory reality of the experiences we have on the level of consciousness is stored in the chakras. That's what the chakras are, is they're where our karma stays. And the chakras are part of the astral body. So the physical body falls away, but the energy pattern that has been created over the course of this lifetime is still there. And when we're born, the energy pattern of all our past lifetimes is completely present. That's why that little boy, seeing himself in the mirror, suddenly recognized himself. It's just like, oh yes, that's right, I'm not a child. There was a young boy who's now about 18. I saw him not too long ago. He looks just as he did when he was a baby. Not everybody does. To phrase it differently, as a baby he looked like the man he was going to become. And I recall once his mother was changing his diaper. He was about 2 or maybe 1.5. And he had his head turned like this. And it was like you could feel him trying to get as far away from this completely undignified experience as he possibly could. He recognized the necessity for her to change his diapers, but please, can't we get beyond this as fast as possible? You know, the myth of it being so fun to be helpless is not really there. It's all of this we carry, and so when I started talking about that childhood experience, I was torn between my own embarrassment at having, in that case, lied and been dishonest, and the sweetness of my mother's response to it, both of which I remember. Both of those realities brought me to tears. Now just think about it. You know, some of you I know, even as we speak, are going through difficult situations, or anticipate that you might. And I have aging relatives that I know are going through very difficult things at the end of their lives. But imagine that none of that really goes away. And that when we move through this world, we're always acting on behalf of all of that. I had a terrible karmic antagonism with a person with whom I've long since reconciled. But at one point in the midst of that karmic antagonism, I had what I believe was a true dream of some of the origin of that intense conflict. And it happened, you know, in centuries past on a level of violence and real abuse, mutual, I have to be the first to admit. It wasn't only that someone was doing something to me. The reason I was being pounded into a pulp is because I had done the pounding. I mean, nothing happens out of accident. You beat someone down, and they lie in wait until they get big enough to stomp on you. That's just the way it works. And you go back and forth and back and forth. But as a result, there was this great mistrust. And I could see that what was happening in the present was totally influenced by something so long ago, but it might have happened a second ago, for all the lack of freedom that we had in relating to each other. And what all of that brought into my consciousness, which is the purpose of all of this, is deep compassion. You know, that's what God wants us to feel. That's how God feels about us. Divine Mother weeps for us. Master would weep for us. Swamiji tells a few stories about coming in and finding Master in tears. And why are you crying, sir? You know, here he is, the incarnation of bliss. He's one with the infinite spirit, and tears of sadness are running down his face. And Master replied, oh, and he spoke of one of the disciples. He's going to leave the ashram. He's going to go back to his ego-motivated way of life. And Master could see all the suffering that was going to entail. And Master himself wasn't in pain, but he knew himself to be as much in everyone else as he was in his own body. And so their suffering was the same as his, and the more so because he had offered the doorway out and the disciple had rejected it. And now Master would have to wait. He would never give up. And there was no hint of even judgment, just sadness at what he would have to go through. I tell a number of stories about Swamiji like that. He hoped to spare someone the karma and tried to guide them in a certain way, but they were not able to receive that. And so he would have to stand back and wait. I was with Swamiji once when we went to speak at somebody else's church in Reno, Nevada. And he gave a really extraordinary talk that night to a group of people who were not at all really his own, so to speak, but he had the karma to be there with them. And everybody seemed somehow conscious that there was something really unusual happening in the room. And afterwards he stood and he greeted people, and I was a little distance just watching this. And he was so, Swamiji stood in what I can only describe as timelessness. You could sense it if you were sensitive enough. He was just standing in the eternal now. And all the people around him were living in the relative world. They were themselves. It was Reno, and it had a certain quality to it, of energy that is characteristic sometimes of Nevada. But they were New Agey, psychic, sort of oriented people. And each one of them just came up, and Swami barely moved his body, and he didn't shake anyone's hand as he usually does. He just stood like this. It was almost like he wasn't able to come out enough to actually have physical contact. He could only have this kind of contact, just vibrational. And it was like I didn't know what plane of consciousness we were on. I didn't know what city we were on, where we were. There was just this eternal witness on Swamiji's part to the true reality, which is, here is the inner world. I'm going to be a doorway for you, Swamiji was essentially saying, of what your own potential is, and I'm just going to reflect that to you. People would come and they would essentially receive as much as they could receive and then go on. And I saw myself as part of that with Swamiji, with other saints, with our line of gurus, with Jesus. When I read the New Testament, and we're coming into Easter, and I've begun to think again about that story, I know some of you feel it the same way I do. It's like I walk those streets of Jerusalem. I must have been there. I can't imagine that I wasn't, because it's all so real to me. Those people in that story, they're not like ancient biblical figures that spoke in strange ways. They're you and they're me, and they're just walking down the street and they're struggling with exactly what we're struggling with. There's a wonderful phrase in the Bible toward the end of Jesus' life, when he began to have to winnow out those who would be too weak to go on, and he started challenging them, and one of the students said one to the other, "This is a hard teaching." You know, how often we say that, don't we? This is a hard teaching. You have the story of Peter, and Jesus at the Last Supper is telling Peter that he's going someplace where you cannot go. Peter, with great bluster, says, "I'll go anywhere you go, Jesus." Jesus says to him, "Will you? Just will you?" And then he says 3 times before the dawn comes, "You will deny that you even knew me." You know? And Jesus doesn't say that like with a shaking finger. I think he told Peter that so that when that exact thing happened, Peter would be able to say in his heart, he knew. And still, he loved me. You see, because we're carrying so much, and this whole world is just a window onto that inner world. And the power of the masters, and this is why it's emphasized so much, and this is where the orthodoxy of Christianity makes a terrible mistake, because they just drop Jesus in on us. He has no past, he has no future, he has no real relationship to us, except, thank God, he dies on the cross and saves us. But the true story is that the self-realized masters are self-realized. In other words, the path that we are walking is the path that they have walked, which is they were bound in ego consciousness, and step by step, with the kind of willpower and devotion that they show in their lives. That's why the masters have sadhana. That's why they long desperately for God. That's why Yogananda goes for this intense training with this demanding guru, because they have to really show us how this is done. That's why taking those years out of the Bible, the so-called lost years of Jesus, in which Jesus went to India and sat at the feet of the masters and did sadhana and showed us how to be a devotee, which he surely told his own disciples. It's just later this idea came, oh no, they have to be completely different than us. But you see, it leaves us lost, guilty, afraid. Whereas knowing that the masters have walked this path with us, and there's a story that Swami tells in the path where Master was urging upon one of his disciples a challenging task, and he was trying to get him to do it, and the disciple was waffling on it, and finally the disciple said, "Well, of course you can do it, sir. After all, you're a master." And Master Swamiji says, thunder to him, "And what do you think made me a master?" He said, "It was by doing, by affirming my strength, not by hiding from my own potential." So everything that we're living in this world, every day, every little tiny thing, that's the most astonishing part of it. Every little tiny thing. Because I've been working with the children, I had this costume rack, and what I actually said is the damn thing fell apart, and there's these small children. Like this. And I think, because of those children, I can't say that. But then I had to look at the fact that I didn't decide whether or not to say that. That's just what came out of me. And then you have to stop and ask yourself, why would I damn anything in this world? You see, it's the smallest things. If there is no time, and if it is the eternal now. Swamiji, he's written this book, he's rewritten a book. It used to be called Do It Now. He now calls it Do It Well. Timeless Wisdom for Everyday Life, I think, something like that. There's this one extraordinarily enigmatic but fascinating aphorism, because it's 366, one for every day of the year, including leap year. And it says, think of time as radiating from your own heart, and the past and present are a river, the river behind you and the river in front of you, but you stand in the eternal now, and time swirls around you. I was meditating on that, just sort of sitting there with time swirling around us. So often the great masters just talk about that. And I know there's a very popular book out now called Now, I think, because so much of what this world is trying to tell us about the inner world is that it's not really happening. And that all that ever happens is the consciousness that we have right now. And we corrupt that consciousness with this enormous preoccupation with the things that happened in the past, and this profound belief that those situations are actually relevant. And that's just what I was talking about. I talk about stealing these little potholders when I was at camp when I was 7, and I find myself wanting to dry a tear. Honey, you were 7 years old and they were potholders. Yes, because I'm deeply convinced that what happened in the past is relevant in the present. And then I anticipate, what will happen if the economy gets worse? How will we be able to pay our rent in the community? What will we do when people start losing their jobs? And you become like this. But the fact is, it's impossible to solve problems in the future because it's not the future yet. That was what I finally began to understand years ago about intuition. The reason I don't know the answer to that question is because it's not time to solve it. Because when all the conditions are right for it to be solved, then it will be now. And that's one of the methods, jnanic methods that I've used to ease a tendency to anticipate. To just say, well, of course I can't answer that now, because it's not now. And when it's now, all the conditions for answering that question will be in place. And then the intuitive answer will be there. But you see, it's always now. We can worry about what those nows are going to be like, and we can lament what those nows used to be. But what we are actually experiencing is what we have brought into this reality. We stand in the eternal now, and time like a river swirls around us. Think of the extraordinary freedom of that. And it doesn't mean, as I sometimes am, which is you have to make all the decisions at the last minute. That is an abuse of this principle, I have to add. But nonetheless, there is a certain simple truth to it. And it is the habits that we build up over many incarnations. It's not the events. It's the habit of how we respond. You see, that's what's recorded in the chakra, is the habit, the fear, the anxiety, the pain, the memory of the pain. Swami Kriyananda made an interesting statement once. What he essentially said, really, is that there's nothing in his chakras. He didn't state it quite as bluntly as that. But what he said was that his subconscious and his conscious mind are exactly the same. That there's no point at sleep or wakefulness or meditation when the consciousness is different. Certainly when I have dreams often of situations that I know are not present day. And I'll get caught up in the rising memory of fears or anxieties or wrongdoing. And there's always a point, thank God. I do keep my consciousness to this extent when I'll think, this was such a stupid thing to do. Why did I get myself into this? And that's usually the point at which I can wake myself up. Because I'll say, you're not that stupid. You know, I can remember enough. You're not that dumb. And then I'll realize that I'm dreaming and I wake up. But you know, the memory of it is still there. But you see, in waking life, we're often deeply influenced by all of that. And we either react with fear or we live in anxiety because we are that stupid. And the masters weep for us and wait with total understanding and total compassion because they've been there. I quoted to you not too long ago what Swamiji said when we were with him recently. It was so dear. We were sitting at the dinner table, and I really don't think he brought it up for any reason. He just said, it's really not hard to get out of the ego. He says, it's just a little turn. He said, it's really quite easy, just a little turn like that. Isn't that wonderful to meditate on? Just all of this that I'm talking about, all these past life experiences that are all stored in the chakras and this great big thing, all we have to do is just step outside of it and realize that it happened, but not to me. It just happened. And now I live in the eternal moment, and the river of all that swirls around me. But I am as I have always been. Isn't that what Ananda Ma says? I am as I have always been. I was in bliss when I was young, when I was a woman, when I was married, when I was not married. I am the same. Meditate on that, deeply meditate on that. Use that as the doorway for the outer world to tell you about the true world inside.